You ever wonder how a huge wave of new people can just completely shake up a country's politics? Well, that's exactly what happened in British North America between 1815 and 1855. It triggered this fundamental battle over power, money, and the very idea of what a government should be.
All right, let's kick things off with just one number, a really big one, 1 million.
Yeah, 1 million. That's how many immigrants landed in what would eventually become Canada, all in just a 40-year span. Now, this wasn't just a population boom. It was like a shockwave hitting a colonial system that was built for a much, much smaller, simpler world.
And that's really the heart of the matter, isn't it? When you get this incredible influx of people, it puts immense pressure on everything. And it sparked this conflict over the very soul of how the place should be run. A conflict that, honestly, would set the course for modern Canada.
Okay, so let's dig into exactly how this population explosion started to challenge the old way of doing things.
So, as you can see here, there were a bunch of key pressures that really pushed the old system right to its breaking point. I mean, suddenly you have all these new groups with totally different ideas about the economy and politics. You've got farmers, right? They desperately need roads to get their goods to market. They need land to farm, but guess what? Huge chunks of the best land were locked up by the elite in these clergy and crown reserves. And at the same time, the economy is getting way more complicated, which meant you needed more local decision-making. But of course, that was a direct threat to the power of the guys at the top. It was the perfect storm for a massive political showdown.
And this pressure cooker situation basically forced a major clash between two groups with completely different visions for the future. You had the oligarchs, the ones holding all the power, and then you had the reformers, who were demanding a voice for the everyday person.
And this quote here really gets to the heart of their ideological split. See, both sides were looking at the massive revolutions that had just turned the world upside down, the American and the French, but they drew completely opposite conclusions. One group saw a terrifying warning, while the other saw a powerful inspiration.
And this really lays it all out, doesn't it? Two totally opposing worldviews. On one side, you have the oligarchy. They basically saw the general public as, well, uneducated and kind of dangerous. They were convinced that power had to stay in the hands of the wealthy elite to stop society from falling into chaos. But the reformers, they had the exact opposite take. They argued that the only legitimate power comes from the people themselves.
So let's start with the group that was actually in charge, the Tory elites. You might know them as the Family Compact in Upper Canada and the Chateau clique in Lower Canada. And these weren't just politicians. They were a super tight-knit network of wealthy merchants and landowners, all bound together by this deep collective fear of anything that looked like American-style democracy.
So yeah, this is basically how the system was rigged. People could go and elect their representatives to an assembly, sure, but the real power? That was held by these appointed councils at the very top, which, surprise, surprise, were controlled by the oligarchs. They could just shut down any decision the people's representatives made, just like that, vetoed.
And you better believe they used this power to enrich themselves. They funneled public money into these huge projects like canals that just so happened to directly benefit their own shipping businesses, all while pretty much ignoring what the growing population actually needed.
And canals are the absolute perfect example of this. Think about it. These massive, super expensive projects were amazing if you were a merchant in the Family Compact trying to move your goods. But for your average farmer who was just trying to get their crops to the local market, they were totally useless.
Okay, so that's the establishment. Now let's talk about the opposition, the reformers. These were the folks who were speaking for that huge growing majority. You know, the farmers, doctors, journalists, all the everyday settlers who were being completely shut out of power.
So what were they asking for? Roads. It sounds so simple, right? But this whole debate over roads versus canals, it perfectly captured the bigger fight. It was public good versus private profit. The reformers were basically saying, hey, our tax money should be used to benefit everyone, not just a handful of well-connected rich guys.
And this is so important to understand. The reformers weren't just fighting for better roads. They were fighting for this revolutionary idea at the very core of their movement, responsible government. All that really means is that the people who actually run the government, the executive council, should only be able to stay in power if they have the support of the people's elected representatives in the assembly. It's a government that's actually accountable to the people it governs.
So for years, the reformers, they tried to change things the peaceful way. But the oligarchies, they weren't about to just give up their power. It created this total political deadlock that pushed the colonies right to the edge.
And eventually, all that frustration boiled over into actual armed conflict. The rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada were ultimately crushed by government forces, but they sent a loud, clear, and pretty violent message back to Britain. This system is broken. It's not working. It's totally unsustainable.
And those rebellions, they set off a crazy fast chain reaction. The shock of the violence actually forced Britain to pay attention and do something. They sent over a guy named Lord Durham to figure out what went wrong, and his famous report came back with a key recommendation: give the colonies more self-government. And from there, things moved quickly. Within just a decade, the very thing the reformers had been fighting for all along, that principle of responsible government, was finally a reality.
All right, so let's tie this all back to where we started. Back to that huge number.
That wave of 1 million new people, that was the catalyst. It cranked up the pressure so high that the old, rigid system just couldn't take it. It fueled the fight that ultimately led to a much more democratic way of governing. It really goes to show you that democratic systems aren't just handed down from on high. More often than not, they're forged in the fire of immense social pressure and the simple, powerful demand for a voice.
And that kind of leaves us with a question for our own time, doesn't it? The same forces that shaped Canada back then, things like migration, economic change, and the demand for real representation, they're still very much at play today, constantly pushing and reshaping our political systems right now.